So this morning my theme is Sanctified Perception, How Worship Works. And you should have outlines again to follow along. There's a few dense quotes from a French theorist named Pierre Bourdieu, who I really am indebted to. And so I wanted to give you those because those would be brutal to just listen to. And I want to build on some of the foundation we laid last night by suggesting that I think even if what your interest is apologetics, I think apologetics has a vested interest in getting this liturgical claim, or we could put it this way, apologetics needs to appreciate the role and centrality of the imagination in how people make sense of their world and how they understand the world. And in some ways, I ended last night with Blaise Pascal, who in a way I think is a patron saint of this project. And I was thinking as another bridge to last night, Pascal's approach to apologetics sort of shores up my thesis in this sense. How many of you have read Pascal's Wager? Okay, famous arguments of a sort, famous strategy at least for getting people to consider faith. It's sort of a game theoretical approach in which if you believe in God and God, I'm always going to get this wrong. If you believe in God and God doesn't exist, really you don't have that much to lose. But if you don't believe in God and God does exist, you have like infinite loss that's possible. And so he goes through all of these machinations and says, really, from a game theoretical perspective, the best move, the best wager, the best bet is to believe in God. There's all kinds of challenges and problems with that argument. But what interests me is actually the end of that strategy, which we don't always get in our anthologies in philosophy of religion, where in a way his interlocutor says, okay, I understand, I know what you mean, I get the argument, but I still find myself unable to believe. To which Pascal's reply is, go to church. That is, why? Because by being immersed in the ecclesial community and the practices of the ecclesial community, what actually happens is the reformation of the plausibility conditions that you bring to this. It's a little bit of that intuition that sometimes we now hear described of belonging before you believe. And that way of putting it, belonging before you believe, being immersed in a community of practice in order to sort of foster faith, grows out of the kind of anthropology that I've been laying out over these last couple of days, because what it's saying is being immersed in tangible, visceral practices does something to your imagination, to your loves, to your longings, that then might make faith possible. It's a practical, embodied way of reshaping our plausibility conditions. So let's then move with that kind of intuition in mind, because in a way what I'm going to argue is I actually think the church is essential to apologetics. Which is not, I often find apologetics works as a substitute for church. So I'm suggesting there is no Christian apologetics outside the church, or without the church at least. So let's talk about the little things. Both Christian theology and apologetics need to appreciate that we know with our bodies in some sense, that belief is in our bones. In a way, we tend to a rather Gnostic thinking thingism that tends to underestimate the significance of what Merleau-Ponty called, last night we saw, practonosia, that know-how that we acquire in our gut. Consider a very simple illustration. I remember coming across this little case study. Peter McLaren is an ethnographer and sociologist of education. And he did a series of case studies in urban education. And one of the principles he found was that every teacher has what he calls a power spot. Every teacher has a power spot. What that means is there is some space in a classroom where when the teacher stands there, she or he commands authority from the students. There's some kind of inchoate, tacit understanding that when the teacher's there, no fooling around, we mean business. And what was interesting is McLaren he would often visit classrooms and would be there present while the teacher was working. But one time a teacher in his class had to get called away to the office for something. And so he just stood in to kind of try to manage things while she was out. And as you can imagine, when the teacher leaves, when the cat's away, the mice will play sort of principle. And they start bouncing around and carousing and all these challenges. And so he's just standing up front asking them to be quiet and stuff. But then what he realized, and he didn't know this principle yet, but what he realized was once he moved to a certain spot in the classroom, all of a sudden it started getting quieter and quieter. And then eventually he got to a place and a student put up her hand and said, "Are you the teacher now?" Now, what's interesting is that teacher had never identified a power spot. That teacher had never communicated didactically to the students, when I am standing here, I'm not fooling around, this is my power spot, you better do what I say. No, there was no didactic mode of teaching that, and yet there was a kind of know-how, a kind of understanding that this class had clearly absorbed just from the practices of how that classroom space was managed. I'm interested in that kind of knowing, that kind of understanding, where we absorb, I don't want to say intuitions because that's a really loaded philosophical term, but we have a kind of inchoate, tacit knowledge of things. What would it mean to think of Christian formation as also that kind of unconscious education? As an education of our unconscious, something that is also inscribed on our bodies as much as it is deposited in our minds. Did you notice how I put that? As much as it is deposited in our minds. I didn't say instead of being deposited in our minds. So my goal today is to suggest that this is in fact how worship works. That is, this is how liturgical formation works to shape the imagination and our habits. Liturgies, both Christian and secular, this is going to be important in a second, liturgies are embodied, enacted performances that inscribe in us a faith that gets under our skin. And I think that means that our apologetics needs to appeal to our embodied imagination, but it also needs to target our practiced deformations, our liturgical deformations. Christian apologetics can't just counter wrong thinking. It needs to expand to identify and counter disordered formations. In short, what might it look like for Christian apologetics to consider the formative and deformative role of liturgical practices, including cultural practices that function as secular liturgies, that train us to love other kingdoms? Okay? To try to unpack this, I want to draw on the work of Pierre Bourdieu as a bit of a conceptual toolbox to get at these issues. And again, I just find Bourdieu gives us a sort of lexicon and a set of concepts that can help us name and sort of describe the phenomena that I'm talking about. Bourdieu is interested in what he calls the logic of practice. The logic of practice. You might think of his point as rather Pascalian. Pascal famously said, "The heart has reasons of which reason knows nothing," which I sadly saw on a Hallmark card one time, which just was incredibly disappointing. The heart has reasons of which reason knows nothing. Bourdieu at one point says this: practice has a logic of which logic knows nothing. Or, as he puts it elsewhere, practice has a logic which is not that of the logician. It's a logic that is performed directly in bodily gymnastics. So it's not just that, and he calls this a practical sense. A practical sense. It's not just that practical sense is a clunky, unrefined version of real logic. His point is that practical sense has its own irreducible logic. Something can make sense on the order of habitus. Okay, so we talked about habit last night, right? For some reason, Bourdieu just always uses the Latin term habitus to name habit. So if you hear me using that term, it's because it's Bourdieu's term. He's saying something can make sense on the order of habit or habitus that cannot be diagrammed as a syllogism. You notice there's still a logic to it. There's still a kind of rationality about it. It's just not the kind that can be diagrammed by formal logic. This has significant implications if we think of Christian faith as a kind of habitus, as a kind of practical sense. But by the way, just to keep the apologetic point, it also means that exclusive humanism, naturalism, also has a practical sense. Lots of people are, Charles Taylor, have I talked about exclusive humanism before? Okay. So, lots of people are naturalists or exclusive humanists, not because they've reached the deduction of a series of arguments, but it's because they have absorbed a practical sense about the world. And if they weren't convinced and argued into their exclusive humanism, all of your arguments against it are not going to argue them out of it, because they weren't argued into it to begin with. They absorbed it as this practical sense, right? They absorbed it at the level of a story that captured their imagination, and that makes sense of their lives on this existential level. So for Bourdieu, we acquire this habitus, a practical sense that orients our being in the world through our immersion in a social body. I guess this is, if I can push back again a little bit on sort of major paradigms in apologetics, I think a lot of paradigms in apologetics treat every person as if they were these lone atomistic individuals and have no appreciation for the social dynamics that shapes why and who people are. Why they believe what they believe, right? Our habitus, Bourdieu says, is a practical sense that is always acquired and shared. Our practical sense is always learned. You're not born with it. It's not hardwired. It's acquired, and it is shared. It's communal. It's always a social reality. That's who you acquire it from. So he's very interested in the dynamics of incorporation and initiation. And I want you to hear in those terms, to be incorporated, at the heart of that word is corpus, which is body, but to be incorporated into a body. You notice we use the word body in two ways, at least two ways. On the one hand, we can be talking about the material body, but we also use the word body to describe social units, right? So the church is a body, the body politic, and so on. So when Bourdieu is talking about incorporation, he's interested in how my identity and practical sense is formed by being incorporated into a social body. So you'll want to hear those two things. That's the process of initiation. And by the way, if you know anything about the church's ancient catechumenate and the process of Christian initiation, this is all very ancient sort of monastic language in a way. So habitus, then, habit, is Bourdieu's shorthand concept for that nexus of dispositions that makes it possible for us to perceive the world, to experience our environment, to constitute a context, and act therein. It's the visceral plausibility structure by which we make sense of our world and move within it. But the question is, how is such a visceral plausibility structure learned and absorbed? The acquisition is described by Bourdieu as a slow process of co-option, initiation, and incorporation. But how exactly does that work? How are we co-opted? What are the means and dynamics of initiation? How is incorporation accomplished? In answering these questions, Bourdieu develops a notion of embodied pedagogy that provides unique resources for us to conceive how liturgical formation works, including how secular liturgies tacitly form in us a distinctive habitus. Now, not surprisingly, my incorporation into a social body is affected through the social body co-opting my body. So there's always this very material dynamic. The dynamics of initiation are kinesthetic. The operation is almost Proustian, you could say. Look at verse 1. You know you're a liberal when. Quote 1. This is from Bourdieu's Logic of Practice. Every social order systematically takes advantage of the disposition of the body and language to function as depositories of deferred thoughts that can be triggered off at a distance in space and time by the simple effect of replacing the body in an overall posture which recalls the associating thoughts and feelings in one of the inductive states of the body, which, as actors know, gives rise to states of mind. That's clear, right? What he's saying is social bodies co-opt us and incorporate us by putting our bodies through the paces, rituals and rhythms and rites that sort of inscribe in us an orientation so that whenever you are then sort of put through those rites again, that all kind of comes back in the package, right? You're sort of recalled into that. States of the body give rise to states of mind. Here's the refusal of intellectualism and the recognition that our most fundamental orientation to our world is embedded in our bodies. So a social order or a social body recruits me by conscripting my body through the most mundane means, through bodily postures, repeated words, ritualized cadences. If you don't believe this, just ask yourself, why do public schools do the Pledge of Allegiance at the beginning of each day? That's all you need. That's the only case study you need. And then remember William Kavanaugh's provincial farm boy from yesterday. Okay? The body politic implants in me a habitus by immersing me in an array of tangible movements and routines that effectively kind of deposit an orientation within me, a stance, a comportment to the world. This is the mechanics of initiation and incorporation. To incorporate bodies into the social body and to inscribe a common shared habitus into our bodies in such a way that we sense this in ways we don't know. Right? You always sort of understand more than you know. In this way, the very posture of our body can itself be a kind of cognizance. And our bodies can know even when our conscious mind might be otherwise engaged. Indeed, the posturing of our body can call up an entire world of sense, a web of associations and understandings that reframe our very being in the world. When a social body has successfully incorporated me through ritual formation, then what I know in this way is triggered by the same movements and postures, even as he puts it, at a distance from the ritualized space. What he means is that you might have spaces where a body politic has sort of concerted ritual participation. Right? And so when we gather, we do these rituals. But what he's saying is when you are immersed in those over and over again, even when you are outside of that ritual space and things like that come up, the meaning of those rituals gets activated outside of that space. Okay? And I know our tendency is going to be to think about this in specifically Christian and institutional religious terms. But if you really want to feel the force of this, you have to think about like football stadiums, malls, movie theaters. You have to realize what's going on in those other, what we don't tend to think of as ritual spaces. The embodied ritualized formation then begins to spill over into other spheres, shaping and priming my perception of the world in other spheres of experience. In other words, the ritual is not an end in itself, nor is it merely a script for one compartment of my life, because it inflectively implants a habitus in me that begins to govern across my whole life, right? And it shapes my very orientation to the world. By putting the body through these paces, the social body that has a vision of the good life incorporated in it sort of marshals my body to act as a kind of organ of that wider body. And so it primes my action in ways that resonate with the vision of the social life well beyond those specific ritualized sites. In ways that resonate with what I have called pedagogies of desire, Bourdieu describes these formative cultural rituals as pedagogies with cosmic dimensions. Here's the money quote. This is quote number 2 on your outline. One could endlessly enumerate the values given body, made body, by the hidden persuasion of an implicit pedagogy, which can instill a whole cosmology through injunctions as insignificant as sit up straight or don't hold your knife in your left hand, and inscribe the most fundamental principles of the arbitrary content of a culture in seemingly innocuous details of bearing or physical and verbal matters, so putting them beyond the reach of consciousness and explicit statement. Okay, this is gold. But what do you see what he's saying? First of all, he's saying these cultural practices are implicit pedagogies because they are training your unconscious. They are training, in language we used yesterday, they sort of are training your imagination, your wants, your longings, your desires. But they do this through seemingly innocuous ways that seem like little things, but in fact are instilling a whole cosmology. As if being taught to sit up straight is actually a microcosmic way of saying something about a whole cosmic order. Or holding your fork in your left hand is actually saying something about civilization and order. Or I think, I mean, we could, he runs a lot of analyses of this. I do think it can be very illuminating to consider the very different way that men and women are implicitly taught to comport themselves in space. So I totally grant that when I get to walk in, I command. But women are still implicitly taught to demur. And we care, and that happens in very gut level tacit registers, and yet it sort of bears itself out in our very bodily comportment with one another. Another example, I wish we had, The King's Speech, the movie The King's Speech. The first encounter between the royal family, Bertie, the prince, and Lionel Logue, the Australian colonial, who's the speech therapist, totally different bodily comportments to one another and to the world based on their place in a social body. It's a really interesting picture of that. So the cosmology isn't, by cosmology here, let's just say kind of a worldview sort of thing. The cosmology is instilled not through the dissemination of ideas and beliefs and doctrines, but through more oblique measures that operate on the body and thus bypass consciousness. While a child is learning to sit straight or hold her knife, she is unconsciously absorbing a social imaginary, a picture of social order, a vision for the good life. I'm just old enough that I had a first grade teacher who tried to teach me to write with my right hand because you're not supposed to write with your left hand. It's sinister. And by the way, the teachers of these orders don't always even realize what's being taught. Okay? It's bigger than any of the particular agents. To learn how to stand or how to walk is to learn how to comport oneself to the world, which is in turn to learn how to constitute your world. We are being taught how to perceive the world when we are taught to sit up straight. We are learning how to constitute our social world when we are trained to line up single file. And when we are enjoined to kneel for confession, an entire cosmology is instilled in us. See, this is one of those examples where I think the church's ancient practiced wisdom said that when you confess, you kneel, because this tells your body to be humble, right? And you can't remember Mark Twain's cat. He who holds a cat by the tail learns something he can learn no other way. He who kneels in confession learns humility in a way that will never be the same as just saying it. Okay, that's the intuition. So, quote 3 on your outline. Here, this sort of pulls it all together. The cunning of pedagogic reason, Bourdieu concludes, lies precisely in the fact that it manages to extort what is essential while seeming to demand the insignificant, such as the respect for forms and forms of respect which are the most visible and most natural manifestation of respect for the established order, or the concessions of politeness which always contain political concessions. It's that core phrase, it manages to extort what is essential while seeming to demand the insignificant. The seeming there is what's really important. It seems to only demand the insignificant, but in fact it's instilling a whole cosmology. Such pedagogies are effective precisely because they work in this way, on this unconscious register, not in spite of that. It's not like they would work better if you were really didactic about it. No, that's not the point. The point is they are really effective precisely because they target this preconscious register. And it's because they are incarnate pedagogies, that embodied pedagogies, that they are cunning, operative even when we're not setting out to be trained or formed. These are pedagogies that teach us even when, and perhaps especially when, we haven't signed up to be taught. And you see now, if you're just working with this totally intellectualist account, this intellectualist picture of the human person, you won't realize that your being in the world, your comportment to the world is being trained in all kinds of spaces in which you are not thinking. And might actually be more powerfully trained in those spaces. So these are rhythms that are seemingly innocuous are in fact fundamentally formative, while seeming to demand only the insignificant. In fact, they are extorting what is essential. You can put it this way: our bodies are students, even when we don't realize it. And because we are so fundamentally oriented by this habitus, this incarnate education actually ends up being more powerful. Because this is how worldviews are materialized, how they are incarnated. So it is just to the extent that a social body and its social vision is incarnated that it will be pedagogically successful, able to incorporate members into the body politic and inscribe in them the habitus that defines a people or a polis. So by the way, you can think about national and civic rites and practices and rituals in exactly the same way. So my acquisition of a habitus is always at the same time a matter of my being acquired by a people or a polis. There are no private individuals. There are no individuals. You know what I mean? Like you're always, you've been co-opted by some body that has a social imaginary that you are participating in and sharing it. This is why to become educated in this way, to become formed in this way, is to become a certain kind of person whose identity is shaped by that. So let's think about the implications of this in terms of what I've been calling secular liturgies. I hope the implications of thinking about this for Christian worship are beginning to be obvious. Bourdieu has provided us with a conceptual toolbox to help us understand, I think, how worship works, how formative Christian formation and liturgical formation works. However, while we could unpack the implications of that for Christian worship, I think instead I want to focus on the need to recognize that secular liturgies capitalize on the same dynamics. In other words, if this helps us to see how we are incorporated into the body of Christ, it should also help us to understand the dynamics of deformation. A liturgical anthropology not only provides a framework for appreciating the sanctification of our perception, it also provides the resources for articulating, I think, a phenomenology of temptation, of deformation. More specifically, it provides resources for us to discern, and I guess what I mean by that too is, you need something like this in place to understand how and why people are not believers. Do you know what I mean? Like, in other words, it's not like you're an atheist or an agnostic just because you are lacking belief. You believe otherwise. And you have been incorporated into other social visions by other practices and rituals. Okay? It's not like Christian faith just comes in and adds something to a baseline. It's not like you are sort of naturally an atheist and then Christian faith comes in and adds theistic belief. It's a positive other belief, and what I'm saying is that it's characterized by all the same dynamics of imagination, formation, social bodies, and so on. So I think this model provides resources for us to discern the how and the why, both of the formation of non-believers, which might be the apologetic interest, but let's point the finger backwards. I actually think more significantly, it helps us to discern the how and why of our Christian assimilation to visions of the good life that are in fact rivals to the vision of flourishing that is characteristic of God's coming kingdom. This to me is how you make sense of all the ways that Christians become friends of the world. On this unconscious register. If discipleship is a matter of Christian formation, and specifically the formation of the imagination, then we need to realize that the dynamics of deformation work in exactly the same way. And so you need to counter them at the same level and on the same register. Now, I think, for the sake of time, I'm going to skate here a little bit. Again, what the phenomenology of temptation here is, if you're working with the intellectualist thinking thing, brain on a stick model, you will think that sin and assimilation is always the result of conscious, deliberate choices that are made. So you will think sin is always the outcome of some sort of deliberation process that people went through, obviously mistaken, and then they choose consciously to make this bad choice. So then you will also think that the way to prevent that is to correct their thinking, to correct their to fill in knowledge that's lacking, or correct their bad logic or something like that. I think that is a completely inadequate response, because I think most of our sinful behavior and disordered behavior is the product of bad habits, not the outcome of conscious, rational, deliberative choice in that explicit sense. So we would, if we had a little more time, we could get into that. What I'm interested in is, if you have this liturgical piece and you recognize that we are incorporated through the co-option of our imagination into body politics, and that happens through these rituals, these practices, these cultural liturgies, then you'll start recognizing the seemingly innocuous actually becomes very significant, because it could be instilling a whole cosmology. Let me try one example, okay? One concrete case study. So, okay. All machine-human interaction requires an interface of some sort. Do you know what I mean? Machines are never going to do anything for us if there isn't some way of having an interface between humans and machines. And historically, that was a fairly distant, and by the way, that is always a material interface of some sort, okay? But it wasn't until Steve Jobs comes along, who, by the way, was a master of desire. The Walter Isaacson's biography, which I think is just a fascinating book of Jobs, specifically documents that Jobs, first of all, got aesthetics. That's why Apple stuff is also beautiful. And he got desire. And one of the things, especially those of you who are young still might not appreciate that, when the machine-human interface was changed in such a way that we touch things, there's something unique that happens there. There's a relationship that is so tactile and visceral, and we caress our phones. You know, I mean, there is a dynamic. This is like I want you to think of our interaction with our iPhones as a kind of micro practice, a micro liturgy. And you might think, well, dude, it's a phone. Like, what's? It's not just a phone. Now here's remember Bourdieu's theme. They can extort the essential from the seemingly innocuous. That's what these cunning pedagogies do, okay? And that hit home for me where I saw a television commercial one time. Of course, it was a beer commercial. All the best commercials are. And for some reason, this had Lance Armstrong in it. I don't know why that was. But it was a commercial where, so a bunch of guys come out of an apartment office building, end of the day, they come out, their car's on the street. It's not a car that they like, though. It's kind of a crappy piece of car. So they do this. And the car they want is right there available to them. They go to the beach, they're hanging out, it's a bunch of guys, it's a beer commercial, so you know where this is going. They see way down the beach some ladies that they might be interested in, and so what do? They zoom in, and they're immediately available to them. They go to a club, there's a band on stage that they don't like, or a DJ on stage that they don't like. The music that they want is right there. And what I thought was so telling is that almost expresses on a little more macro level the kind of micro pedagogy that's involved here, which is in a way, in a very inchoate, tacit level, my interaction with this machine kind of implicitly trains me to be an egoist or egocentric, to an egocentric cosmology, because now I am just expecting that the world is available to me when I want it, on my terms, and available for me according to my preferences. And I'm not saying, obviously I still have an iPhone, right? You are not getting my iPhone. But what you start to realize is that micro practice, remember Bourdieu says it spills over, and it starts having impacts on how you relate to things more widely. And the commercial sort of embodies, in what way does my immersion in this micro practice start to train me to comport myself to the whole world in a way such that I expect things to be available on my terms, according to my preferences, at my time, and so forth. It's a little bit of a try to concretize this picture somewhat as we're thinking about it. Now notice, it's not doing that because when you get your iPhone, it comes with this long tract that says, oh, by the way, here's how to be egocentric. It's not a didactic training. It's an unconscious training that is shaping implicitly over time. That's the thing about habits. They are formed by practices over time. And you don't realize it. It bypasses reason. And yet when you sort of reflect and step back and sort of do an audit of how you relate to your world, you realize, oh man, yeah, this is why I recently had to delete Twitter from my phone, just because I saw what it was doing to how I related to human beings, my children, for example. And the microcosmic has macrocosmic implications, but not on a didactic intellectual level, but on this imaginative gut level. Okay. Sorry, I do want to leave time for question and answer too. Let me say this, because you can buy the book. So please buy the book. I have 4 kids in private school. Okay, ultimately the constructive response to this is I'm saying the way to counter the deformation of our imagination through such liturgies is through a very intentional, formative Christian community of practice. And I spend a lot of time trying to make an argument that I think historic Christian forms of Christian worship are set up and designed to immerse us in the story of the gospel over and over and over again in ways that not all things that call themselves Christian worship will do this. Because actually, a lot of things that call themselves Christian worship are actually just secular liturgies that have dropped in Jesus content. But when you do that, when you just sort of adopt some secular liturgy of the rock concert or the coffee shop or whatever, and you think, oh no, we're going to sanctify this because we're going to put Jesus into that form, it's the form, though, that is forming you. And so you might think that you're sanctifying Jesus, but you're actually commodifying him. Because if you turn church into a mall experience, we all know what malls are for. They are for to provide stuff to make us happy. And now you've just done that to Jesus, and you're not preaching the gospel. And you're not, more importantly, what's happening is you're not creating a counterformative community of practice that actually reforms and transforms your imagination to be ordered to the kingdom of God. So I do think the conversation that Christians have to have is to think about what does Christian worship need to look like if it is going to be counterformative to those powerful secular liturgies. And I think what it's going to look like is ancient Christian worship. A lot of historic intuitions about that. I also think it looks like John Calvin's Geneva, but that's because John Calvin's Geneva would look ancient to us. We underestimate the extent to which John Calvin's Geneva, for us today, would look Catholic. Okay? All right. Finally, what would this mean for apologetics? I'm not a big fan of militaristic metaphors, but let's say this. The battle is for the imagination. And that means, in some sense, apologetics needs to be aesthetic. Cardinal Ratzinger, right before he became Pope Benedict XVI, actually I think it was in the conclave before his election, said the church's apologetic comes down to two things: her saints and her art. Her saints and her art. Because the saints are pictures, icons of the good life well lived. They are models for us to imitate. That imitation language is habit language, is virtue language, and it's all over the New Testament. But he also says, and the other part of our apologetic is our art, because it pictures what a meaningful Christ-shaped life looks like. It invites people, it taps into people's imagination. So I want to close with a poem, because I ultimately think the shape of our witness in this sense is aesthetic, is poetic. I think persuasion is ultimately poetic. This is one of my favorite poems. I'm not even going to comment it. I'm just going to close with it, because to comment on it would be to didacticize it, and that's not the point. So this is a poem by Jeannie Murray Walker called Staying Power. And you'll notice that the little epigraph says, in appreciation of Maxim Gorky, who was a very famous atheist, at the International Convention of Atheists in 1929. I want to make sure I know what I'm doing here. Okay. Like Gorky, I sometimes follow my doubts outside and question the metal sky, longing to have the fight settled, thinking, I can't go on like this. And finally I say, all right, it's improbable, all right, there is no God. And then, as if I'm focusing a magnifying glass on dry leaves, God blazes up. It's the attention maybe to what isn't there that makes the notion flare like a forest fire, until I have to spend the afternoon spraying it with the hose to put it out. Even on an ordinary day when a friend calls, tells me they've found melanoma, complains that the hospital is cold, I whisper, God, God, I say as my heart turns inside out. Pick up any language by the scruff of its neck, wipe its face, set it down on the lawn, and I bet it will toddle right into the God fire again, which, though they say it doesn't exist, can send you straight to the burn unit. Oh, we have only so many words to think with. Say God's not fire. Say anything. Say God's a phone, maybe. You know you didn't order a phone, but there it is. It rings. You don't know who it could be. You don't want to talk, so you pull out the plug. It rings. You smash it with a hammer till it bleeds springs and coils and clobbered up metal bits. It rings again. You pick it up, and a voice you love whispers, hello. Thank you.
We do have about 10 minutes for questions. We are going to eschew old technology and just use our God-given vocal cords. So speak up, and then if we could, Jamie, to have you speak into the microphone again. He will do his own moderating, and so about 10 minutes, and then we'll close again. So,
great.
Questions?
Andrew.
I appreciate that you ended with the Pope, too. I'm an evangelical, low church evangelical like you are.
Yep.
Pascal doesn't say we should go to church. He says we should go get holy water and go to Mass.
Mass. Yeah, I was trying to do it translate for a Baptist audience.
I understand. I love what you're doing. My concern is, how do I bring that into the evangelical church?
Right.
And there's three things, I think, just from your talk, that make me very discouraged about the possibility. The first one is, my church is ahistorical. They don't even know why they're called the evangelical free church. They don't know what the free means. They don't know if they know what
Yeah.
Offering some days or what, they don't understand what
Right.
In terms of the art, saints, the aesthetic side, evangelical church being the aesthetic draw, our saints, our art were the comic books with Eliot's in it.
Yes. Which is not nothing. Which is not nothing.
But it's a lot different
Yeah.
than the art of the Catholic
Yeah.
Church or the Orthodox Church or even the Lutheran Church.
Yeah.
Or even the Calvinist. And the last is the social side of it. You're talking a lot about social community. Honestly, most of us are coming from churches that have a political bent that's not very interested in community or the social side of things. Margaret so
Yeah.
radical
Yeah.
individualism of our political background, of our churches, makes it very difficult. So how do you,
Yeah.
what's your idea? Like, what's the best practice? I mean, like, hopefully you have encouraging stories of churches that do that.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I do. I think I would say, I see afoot, and there could be a generational difference here, but I see increasingly students I work with and then 20-somethings who feel the poverty of the kind of mega churchized experience that they grew up with, and actually their frustration with that is opening them to recovering historic practices. I will also say, interesting, because I am part of a denomination that is in the magisterial Reformation, so it's pretty easy for us to retrieve Catholicity. Do you know what I mean? Like we say the creed, so that's easy. An evangelical free church or a non-denominational church, way harder to get the logic of that. What's intriguing to me is that even I know non-denominational congregations who, because they get this formative point, and once they realize that the forms that they had inherited are actually secular liturgies that have a different telos about them, it just becomes a catalyst for them to catechize their congregations to understand why they should do it differently. So I think in those cases what has happened is they don't just change things and people are like, what's going on? Did we just become Roman Catholic or something? Instead, they sort of, and this is an interesting point, they didactically invite them to reflect on what's at stake in their practices, to then invite them at the end of that, if they are convinced, to say, these practices, historic formative practices, are not owned by Rome, Canterbury, Constantinople. Do you know what I mean? They are the small c Catholic heritage of the body of Christ. So I spend a lot of my time trying to convince evangelicals to be Catholic in that sense. And I've just experienced a lot of openness in that respect. I do think non-denominational congregations and free church congregations have another hurdle in terms of ecclesiology to deal with. But it's interesting, when I was writing Desiring the Kingdom, I had to decide whether to do the analysis of secular disordered liturgies first, which would be odd. Why wouldn't you start with the rightly ordered Christian liturgies? But I decided pedagogically that if you first help people to see what was at stake in the disordering liturgies, it would open them up to the need for rightly ordering liturgies. And I think catechetically that would be the strategy to take in something like that. So yeah, I think there are signs of hope and encouragement in that regard. Yeah, you're welcome. Sir. You're welcome.
Yeah. Rick Warren had made a statement one time where he said that we need to be involved with actually deed over creed. And it shocked a lot of people when they heard that. And I know you mentioned a lot about the good life and stuff. How do you balance the balance between creed and deed?
Yeah.
And do you see a balance between the two, or do you see that, like Rick Warren, that deed should supersede creed?
Yeah, and I bet I'm not actually a huge Rick Warren fan, but I bet he didn't mean that it should supersede. But I see a constructive feedback loop between the two. So I think of creed, dogma, doctrine as almost the sort of making explicit of what is implicit in our practices. And I think it's important that we do that, because then that also becomes the standard and criteria by which we evaluate our practice. That's how reform happens. Look, Christian practices need reforming. And the Reformation is a great example of the Christian community reflecting on what we were doing in our practices and saying, this is not consistent with the gospel, and so then they reform the practices. So I see a constructive, dialectic between those two things. What worries me, to be honest, is a younger generation who talks like that. Let's focus on deeds instead of creeds. And then that's basically just the way to be Protestant liberals. And eventually, just sort of justice replaces confession. And I think you could think of creeds, dogma, doctrine as the grammar of our faith. and it gives us, it's the articulation of the norms of the faith that keep us, make sure that we are indexed to God and God's kingdom and not just kind of justice or something like that. Yeah, it's a good question. Sir?
So you're probably, I guess I should stand up, you're probably familiar with people kind of bringing up a certain kind of irony in your work about how you're
I am.
communicating these things
Yep.
through texts and kind of lectures that address our like thinking thingness.
Yep.
And so I'd be interested to hear how you kind of, I guess that's just how you do it, but then it made me interested when you're answering the question about the evangelical church and talking about it as if like, when you're trying to transform church practices, you have to do it at this level of convincing church leaders of this new idea of formation. And it's almost like you're doing it in that thinking thing sense to bring that in. And so then how do we, and then how could this have implications for maybe how we train pastors and convince
Yes.
them?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do we need to form them?
Right.
to-
Right. So I would say when I say, if you want to walk a congregation from its kind of intellectualism to getting the importance of the practices, I suggested in some cases you'll want to almost go didactically first. That really is just a principle of charity, of meeting people where they are. Do you know what I mean? Because that's the way they are thinking, and they're probably going to have to be convinced before they're going to entertain it. I also know another Trinity Pres in Charlottesville is a great example of a congregation where what they would do is the pastoral team would sort of quietly introduce a practice and just do it for a while, practice it, and then invite reflection on it. It's totally ad hoc. You just have to sort of feel where your community is. And so that's just being a good teacher in a way. I think you're right. I note at the beginning of Imagining the Kingdom that my project is sort of hypocritical because I'm emphasizing the tacit know-how, but I'm doing so in books with long footnotes. But the one way I try to do it, and I'm a philosopher, and I do think that making an argument for this is important, but the way I try to do it is by having the novels and films and stuff that tap. What I really want to do is quit philosophy when I'm 50 and write novels. But I don't think that's going to happen. But what has to happen is there have to be others who are bearing witness to that in these other modes. Yeah. Sir, Danny.
Should I say that?
Sure.
So this question might be a little bit peripheral, but I think maybe I'm just having trouble thinking about this
Yeah.
just because the implications are so wide. So if you'll allow me to be peripheral. So I feel like if we're thinking about, explaining this way of looking at the way that we are formed to people who are not of faith, I feel like people say, well, you shouldn't wonder that you're a Christian. You were not only taught to think a certain way, but you were like overwhelmed viscerally by like church.
It's sort of like an indoctrination worry or something like that.
Not only
Right.
brainwashed,
Right.
but like body washed.
Right. Right.
Into believing. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I mean, we can always say, well, you were all overwashed as well with your idea, but other people can then say, well, I went to a synagogue and a church and a secular institution, and so like I have more of a multifaceted view and wasn't like forced in a way to
Yep.
think a certain way.
Yep. Yep.
So what would you say?
Yeah, no, it's a very fair concern. I do think my reply would be there is nobody whose imagination hasn't been co-opted by some social practices that have body washed them as well. Do you know what I mean? So there's that's the great myth of sort of the Enlightenment rational man, and it is always a man, by the way, that oh no, I have achieved this space above the fray, and you all might be dupes, but I'm just rational. I mean, no, I don't ever buy that. That said, I actually do think maturation in the faith is also coming to own and feel and sense what's contestable about it and being honest about it. I think that's the difference between really indoctrination and formation. So I don't think formation is the same as indoctrination, because I think indoctrination usually is successful only by sequestering you and making sure that you are insulated from any challenges. That's right. It always has a kind of, get away from the world kind of retreat mentality. Whereas formation is going to be formation that also bumps into what Charles Taylor calls the cross pressures of a secular age. You can't insulate yourself from that. Which means, for example, it's been disconcerting for me because I wasn't raised in the church, became a Christian when I was 18. And so when you have sort of a late conversion like that, you're like always certain about it's just sort of, you're on track. But now when you raise kids in the faith, it can be very disconcerting when your 17-year-old says, yeah, really? I don't know. But I've realized that is actually pretty healthy faith formation too. What we've done is invested in the deep formation of their imagination. So the articulated conversations, you make room for grappling with those cross pressures. I think that's kind of what a Christian liberal arts education is about, for example. But with the hope that by not insulating, you can also make the case for why this is the story you would want to live into. Does that make sense? So let's not identify formation and indoctrination. I think there are differences between the two. Yeah. Last question.
Justin Brierly, he had a challenge for atheists. He invited them to pray every day for 30 days, and then write into his radio show with the results, or email him the results that he talked about on his radio show. Unfortunately, I never heard about the results. So the typical way that I've gone about introducing non-believers to Christianity is through propositions. And it seems, this approach would be very much different, maybe more in line with Brierly's approach. I don't know if you can comment on that, and also maybe some practical ways that we can introduce non-believers to Christianity that's in line with your...
Yeah, no, it's a good question. The Spirit works in a million ways. So some people I became a Christian through Bible prophecy conferences. Would never have anything to do with them today, but that's how I became a Christian. So for some people, that propositional engagement, that can be the catalyst. At the end of the day, we're talking about the operation of the Holy Spirit. And so the conduit. What I'm suggesting is, I actually think a lot of evangelicals have only and narrowly focused on that sort of propositional strategy and have not recognized that there are all kinds of people who are not going to be argued into the kingdom. It's going to be some other operation. And I actually think that it's tapping the imagination. So, I think the novels of Flannery O'Connor and Graham Greene are ways to reach our generation with a vision of the world that is charged with God's presence. And it opens them imaginatively to inhabiting this world differently. And it's also, I spent a lot of time, I just finished this little book on a commentary on Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, and I was thinking about how it could be used by church planters in Manhattan or Seattle or, sort of the most secularized spaces of our culture. And what we need to realize is that in those spaces, the real strangeness of historic Christian communities and practices are exactly the transcendence that people are longing for. I don't think doing church in a way that doesn't feel weird to people, which is the whole seeker-sensitive strategy. No. Because all you've usually done is taken some secular liturgy and you think this is a delivery system for Jesus content. And you don't get that comes with its own formation. What I think will waken people to transcendence in our secularized culture are Gothic cathedrals with smell. But I'm saying it's precisely the weirdness and strangeness of those spaces that don't make any sense to a secular mind that actually open people imaginatively. So I don't have a formula. I'm saying there's many fronts on which, that's why I'm not even opposed to the propositional. I just don't think it's enough. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.